What if I told you the Vatican has already spoken about the final judgment, but almost no one noticed? At first, that question might sound a little strange. For a long time, the idea has circulated that the Vatican holds secrets about the end of the world, about the apocalypse, or even about events that have yet to unfold in human history. Maybe you've heard something like that yourself, in a documentary, in theories floating around online, or in conversations about biblical prophecies. Many people imagine that behind the walls of the Vatican, there must be mysterious archives, hidden ancient texts, and revelations about humanity's final days that were never fully revealed to the public. But what if the reality is actually more intriguing than that? Because when we begin to look more closely at the official documents of the Catholic Church, at historic councils, and even the Catechism itself, we discover something surprising. The Vatican doesn't avoid talking about the final judgment. In fact, the subject appears repeatedly throughout Christian tradition. It just rarely appears in the sensational way many people expect. And that's exactly where one of the most fascinating parts of this story begins. Unlike many popular interpretations of the Book of Revelation, filled with dramatic scenarios, cinematic catastrophes, and precise predictions about dates and events, the theological interpretation followed by the Vatican takes a very different path. For the Church, the final judgment is not presented as an apocalyptic spectacle meant to create fear, but as a profound and definitive moment in human history, a moment when all truth will be revealed. According to Christian tradition, the final judgment is the moment when every human decision, every moral choice, every act of justice or injustice will finally be brought into the light before God. Nothing will remain hidden. Nothing will stay buried in the shadows of history. Everything that once seemed confusing or unfair throughout the centuries will ultimately receive its full meaning. Now think about this for a moment. How many times have you heard about the final judgment only as a scene of destruction? Trumpets sounding, global catastrophes unfolding, terrifying images of the end of the world? Probably many times. That kind of imagery has become incredibly popular in movies, television series, books, and even in some more dramatic religious interpretations. But there's one question that almost no one asks. Do those images actually represent what the Church teaches about the end of time? Or could it be that many of the symbols in Revelation have been interpreted in a completely different way within the theological tradition of Christianity? Have you ever experienced this yourself? Have you heard explanations about the apocalypse that sounded mysterious, yet somehow confusing or even contradictory? That feeling is more common than it seems. The Book of Revelation is one of the most symbolic texts in the entire Bible, filled with powerful imagery, enigmatic visions, and messages that have been interpreted in many different ways over the centuries. And that's exactly why the Catholic Church has always approached this subject with great caution. Throughout history, theologians, scholars, and church leaders have tried to understand the meaning behind those symbols, seeking to distinguish what belongs to prophetic language from what represents deeper spiritual realities. The result is something few people are aware of. Within Catholic tradition, there is an official interpretation for many of these signs associated with the end of time, an interpretation that in many ways looks very different from what usually circulates in popular discussions about biblical prophecy. What you're about to discover might surprise you, because when we begin to examine what the Vatican actually teaches about the final judgment, we realize the question is not simply about when or how the world will end. The focus is far deeper than that. It's about understanding the ultimate meaning of human history, the destiny of creation, and the moment when everything will finally be revealed with absolute clarity. But this raises an intriguing question. If these teachings have existed for centuries, if they are recorded in official church documents, and if they are part of the very foundation of Christian tradition, why does almost no one talk about them today? And perhaps even more importantly, what exactly does the Vatican teach about the signs that will precede the final judgment? To begin understanding that answer, we first need to look at what the Church itself describes as the most decisive moment in the entire history of humanity. What Christian tradition itself describes as the moment when the entire story of humanity will finally make sense. But before we continue this journey, let me ask you a very honest question. When you hear about the final judgment, what comes to mind? Maybe powerful images from the Book of Revelation, perhaps those scenes described in the Bible, trumpets sounding, signs appearing in the heavens, events that seem to mark the end of an entire era. Or maybe something more personal, that deep feeling that one day, everything that now seems unjust or impossible to understand will finally be revealed. A lot of people feel this, but they rarely talk about it openly. And that's exactly why this conversation matters so much, because topics like the final judgment, the end of times, and the Church's interpretation of Revelation are not just theological curiosities. They touch something much deeper within us. They connect with questions that have echoed across generations: the meaning of life, the destiny of humanity, and the moment when the truth about everything will finally come to light. If this subject resonates with you, I want to invite you to be part of this conversation. Leave a comment below and share what you think. When you hear about the final judgment, what is the very first idea that comes to your mind? Do you see it more as a spiritual mystery, as a literal prophecy, or as something we still don't fully understand? I genuinely enjoy reading what you write here, because many times the comments bring deep reflections, personal experiences, and thoughtful questions that make this kind of discussion even richer. And if this conversation is stirring something inside you, if topics like this make you reflect or help you see faith and history from a different perspective, go ahead and leave a like on the video as well. It might seem like a small gesture, but it makes a huge difference. That simple action helps YouTube understand that this type of content deserves to reach more people who are also searching for answers, reflection, and knowledge about spiritual and historical themes that often aren't explored very deeply. And if you enjoy this kind of exploration into Christian spirituality, biblical prophecies, the mysteries of church history, and deeper interpretations of Scripture, consider subscribing to the channel. Because the goal here is exactly that: to keep exploring these topics that spark curiosity and reflection, bringing content that goes far beyond the surface-level explanations we usually find out there. Your participation here, commenting, liking, and subscribing, is what allows this channel to keep growing and bringing this kind of conversation to more and more people. And now that we've begun to open the door to better understand what truly lies behind the Vatican's interpretations of the final judgment, there's something even more interesting we need to look at. Because when we turn directly to the official documents of the Catholic Church, especially what is recorded in the Catechism itself, we discover that the final judgment is not just a symbolic idea or a distant image of the future. It holds a central place in the Christian understanding of humanity's destiny. And that's exactly where the next part of this story begins to get even more surprising. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because when we start looking directly at what the Catholic Church actually teaches about the final judgment, we realize we're not just talking about a distant idea or a symbolic image used in sermons. We're dealing with a concept that sits at the very center of the Christian understanding of human history. And this is where an extremely important document comes into the picture: the Catechism of the Catholic Church. You may have heard about it before, but very few people stop to really understand what this text represents. The Catechism isn't just another religious book. It gathers, in an organized way, what the Church recognizes as its official teaching on faith, morality, spirituality, and the ultimate destiny of humanity. In many ways, it works like a theological map, one that has been shaped over centuries of reflection, decisions, councils, and debates among scholars of the faith. And within that map, there is a very strong statement about the final judgment. According to the Catechism, there will be a moment in history when Christ will fully reveal the truth about every human life and about the entire story of humanity, not only on an individual level but on a universal one. This means we're not just talking about the personal judgment that, according to Christian tradition, happens after each person's death. What the Catechism describes goes beyond that. It speaks of a moment when all creation will be illuminated by truth, a moment when everything that is now hidden behind the scenes of history will finally be revealed with absolute clarity. Think for a moment about the weight of that idea. How many human decisions have shaped the course of history without anyone fully understanding their consequences? How many injustices have happened in silence, far from the eyes of the world? How many choices that seemed small at the time ended up having enormous effects on the lives of others? The vision presented in Catholic theology is that the final judgment will be precisely the moment when all of this finally makes sense. From this perspective, nothing we do simply disappears into time. Every decision, every action, every gesture of kindness or injustice leaves real marks on the story of humanity. Many of those marks remain invisible to us. Others seem to disappear entirely as generations pass. But within the spiritual logic presented by the Catechism, none of those things are ever truly forgotten. There is a hidden truth behind every human story. There are consequences we often don't even notice while we're living our own lives, and the final judgment appears exactly as the moment when that invisible web of decisions and consequences will finally be revealed. This completely changes the way we think about the end of time, because it's not simply about a dramatic event in the future. It's about a profound revelation of the meaning behind everything that has happened throughout human history. What once seemed confusing, unjust, or even meaningless will begin to make sense in the light of a greater truth. The Catechism describes this moment as the definitive revelation of God's justice. Every hidden injustice will be exposed. Every lie that once seemed to prevail will be confronted by the truth. Everything done in silence, both good and evil, will finally be brought into the light. And perhaps this is one of the most powerful aspects of this vision, because while it speaks about judgment, it also speaks about restoration. Christian theology doesn't describe the final judgment merely as a spiritual courtroom, but as a moment when creation itself will be restored, renewed, and fully understood. It's as if the entire story of humanity, with all its pain, achievements, conflicts, and decisions, will finally be placed under a light that reveals the true meaning of every part of that journey. Now, imagine for a moment what this means for the way we see our own choices. If every decision leaves a real impact on history, if every action carries consequences that often reach far beyond what we can see, then human life takes on a far deeper meaning than simply being born, living for a while, and disappearing into time. And that is exactly the awareness the teaching of the final judgment is meant to awaken, a realization that something greater is unfolding behind the scenes of history, something that connects our individual decisions to a much larger journey of humanity as a whole. But here's where things become even more intriguing. If the final judgment reveals the complete truth about human history, then the signs described in Scripture about the end of times must also be understood within that same spiritual logic. And this is exactly where the interpretations begin to get even more fascinating, because many of the symbols in the book of Revelation that seem frightening or mysterious actually carry meanings far deeper than we usually imagine. And if this reflection resonates with you so far, leave a comment below. This makes sense to me. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because when we arrive at the book of Revelation, we step into a territory that both fascinates and confuses a lot of people. Few books in the Bible have sparked as many different interpretations throughout history. It's a text filled with intense imagery, powerful visions, and symbols that seem to unveil the hidden layers of human history itself. When someone opens Revelation for the first time, it's common to encounter scenes that feel almost cinematic. Mysterious beasts rising from the sea, seals being opened, trumpets announcing dramatic events, wars, earthquakes, signs in the sky, catastrophes that seem to involve all of humanity. For many people, these images are interpreted very directly, almost literally, as if each detail were a precise prediction of future events. But when we look at the theological tradition of the Catholic Church, we discover something that completely changes the way this text is understood. Since the earliest centuries of Christianity, scholars, theologians, and church leaders have consistently warned that Revelation should not be read as a simple code of chronological predictions. Quite the opposite. It is a deeply symbolic book, written in a literary style known as apocalyptic language, something very common among Jewish and early Christian communities of the ancient world. This style uses striking imagery to communicate profound spiritual truths. That means many of the figures described in Revelation are not necessarily meant to represent literal creatures or isolated events in time. In many cases, they reflect spiritual conflicts that stretch across generations, human decisions that shape entire civilizations, and invisible battles between good and evil unfolding behind the scenes of history. This perspective completely transforms the way the text is interpreted. For example, when Revelation speaks about wars, crises, and great catastrophes, Catholic theological tradition often understands these images as symbols of moments of moral and spiritual crisis within humanity. Not just physical disasters, but periods when entire societies face deep transformations, conflicts of values and collective decisions that influence the direction of history. Throughout the centuries, the Church has always insisted that revelation must be read with prudence, discernment, and historical context. That doesn't weaken its prophetic power. In fact, it does the opposite. It means its message needs to be understood within a broader spiritual journey, where the symbols point to realities that appear again and again across different eras of human history. Think about that for a moment. Instead of describing a single future event, Revelation may actually be revealing patterns that repeat throughout the human story. Moments when truth and deception collide. Moments when collective decisions push entire societies toward transformation or toward crisis. This way of understanding the text shows that the book wasn't written simply to spark curiosity about the future, but to awaken spiritual awareness. It speaks about choices, about mindset, about the impact human decisions can have, not only in the present, but on the entire course of history. In other words, Revelation exposes spiritual dynamics that often go unnoticed while we're living our ordinary lives. It's almost as if the text opens a window, allowing us to see what normally remains hidden behind historical events. And maybe that's exactly why so many people remain fascinated by this book even today, because even though it was written nearly 2,000 years ago, it still seems to speak directly to the deepest concerns of every generation. At different moments in history, Christian communities have looked at their own crises and recognized echoes of the images described in Revelation. But here we encounter an extremely important detail within the Church's interpretation. According to Catholic tradition, Revelation should never be interpreted in isolation or based solely on individual interpretations. The understanding of this book has always been connected to the Church's collective discernment, to theological reflection, and to the historical context in which it was written. This helps avoid something that has happened many times throughout history: rushed interpretations that try to link each symbol to specific events happening in the present moment. The Church's view is more cautious. It understands that Revelation speaks about deep spiritual realities that run through the entire journey of humanity, revealing patterns of conflict between light and darkness that appear again and again across history. And this is exactly where things begin to get even more intriguing, because if these symbols represent spiritual battles and crises that repeat throughout time, then perhaps the signs of the end of times are not connected to just a single future event, but to a much broader process involving the transformation of humanity itself. If you're on this journey of reflection as well, leave a comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because when Catholic tradition speaks about the end of human history, it doesn't describe it as a sudden, isolated event. Instead, it points to a much broader spiritual journey leading up to that moment, a sequence of developments that, according to the Church's theological reflection, would reveal profound changes in humanity's mindset and in the way people relate to truth itself. This idea appears very clearly in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. There we find a concept that many people have never heard about, yet it carries enormous weight in the Christian understanding of the last times. The Catechism speaks about something called the Church's final trial. This isn't described as a temporary hardship or just another challenging chapter in history. The description points to a moment of intense spiritual tension, a time when the faith of many people would be tested in a profound and powerful way. And when we look closely at that description, something important stands out. It doesn't begin by talking about earthquakes, wars, or physical catastrophes. The focus goes much deeper than that. The final trial described in Catholic tradition is connected to a global spiritual crisis, a period when truth and deception would become increasingly difficult to distinguish, and that detail completely changes how we understand the signs of the end times. According to this perspective, before the final judgment, there would be a period in which many spiritual deceptions spread across humanity, confusing ideas, distorted interpretations of reality, promises that seem to offer quick solutions to humanity's struggles, yet ultimately draw people away from what Christian tradition understands as the truth. And this process doesn't appear overnight. It emerges slowly, in the background of human decisions, within cultural transformations, shifts in collective thinking, and new worldviews that begin shaping entire generations. Gradually, what once seemed clear starts to become uncertain. Values that were considered fundamental for centuries begin to be questioned or reinterpreted. Theological tradition often describes this period as a time when many people would be drawn towards solutions that appear simple on the surface. Promises of rapid transformation, narratives that seem to provide immediate meaning to human suffering, messages that blend truth and illusion so subtly that they become difficult to recognize. And this is where the great confrontation described in Scripture begins to take shape. Not necessarily a physical battle, but a deep collision between two visions of reality. On one side, what the Christian faith presents as spiritual truth. On the other, narratives that seem persuasive yet lead people down very different paths. This tension creates what many theologians describe as a moment of gradual revelation, because when deceptions become more visible, when human decisions begin to show their real consequences, history itself starts revealing what was once hidden. Choices made behind the scenes of culture, politics, spirituality, and collective thinking begin producing visible effects. And that leads us to an important reflection. Perhaps the true signs of the end times are not only found in dramatic events we see in the news or in isolated moments that provoke fear. Perhaps the deepest signs are connected to something much quieter, the gradual transformation of the human mindset. When a society begins to lose the ability to distinguish between truth and falsehood, when collective decisions are increasingly guided by narratives that hide their real consequences, when spiritual values are replaced by empty promises, something begins shifting behind the scenes of history. And it is precisely this kind of transformation that many theologians associate with the signs mentioned in Christian tradition. Not as simplistic predictions, but as revelations about humanity's spiritual journey. A journey in which each generation faces its own choices, its own struggles, and its own decisions about what it believes to be true. Maybe that's why the Catechism describes this period as a trial of faith, because in the midst of so many voices, so many narratives, and so many promises of transformation, every person eventually faces a quiet question: what truth do I truly believe? And when that question begins to echo in the hearts of millions of people at the same time, something profound begins to unfold in human history. If this reflection is making you think, write in the comments, "I'm reflecting on this." Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because when Catholic tradition speaks about the final judgment, it isn't describing a moment of judgment in the way many people usually imagine. Over time, this idea has often been associated only with fear, condemnation, or dramatic images of punishment. But when we look carefully at what actually appears in the Church's theological reflection, we begin to see that the perspective is much broader and, in many ways, far deeper. In this understanding, the final judgment is not simply a spiritual courtroom where individuals are evaluated one by one. It is described as the moment when the entire story of humanity will finally be illuminated by truth. Think about that for a moment. For centuries, billions of human decisions have shaped the course of the world. Some of those decisions were made publicly, in full view of everyone. Others unfolded quietly behind the scenes of history, far from the eyes of most people. Political choices, moral decisions, silent actions that changed the destiny of families, communities, and even entire civilizations. Much of that story remains incomplete for us. We often look at historical events and feel as if something was left unexplained, injustices that seem never to have been corrected, people who suffered without anyone fully recognizing the impact of their lives, decisions that produced enormous consequences, yet whose true motivations remained hidden. Catholic theology teaches that the final judgment is the moment when this hidden truth will finally be revealed, not only about individuals but about the entire journey of humanity itself. It is as if the whole of human history will be placed under a perfect light, one capable of revealing clearly what we now see only in fragments. Decisions that once seemed small will reveal their true impact. Acts of kindness that went unnoticed will show the reach they actually had. Even the conflicts and crises that shaped entire eras will be understood within a much larger perspective. This idea completely transforms the way we think about the final judgment, because from this point of view, it is not merely a moment of condemnation, it is also a moment when justice is restored. Everything that once seemed unfair or unresolved throughout history finally receives an explanation. What once appeared lost or forgotten gains new meaning. Christian tradition describes that moment as the definitive triumph of good over evil. But that triumph does not occur simply as a symbolic victory. It happens through the full revelation of truth. Lies lose their power because everything that was hidden becomes visible. Narratives built on illusion lose their influence when they are confronted by reality itself. And perhaps that is exactly why the final judgment is also described as a moment of profound transformation. Because when truth is fully revealed, the human way of seeing the world changes as well. What once seemed confusing begins to make sense. History stops looking like a chaotic sequence of events and begins to appear as a journey that ultimately led humanity to that moment. In a way, the final judgment represents the moment when every question finally finds its answer. Not only the great questions of history, but also the ones each person carries within. Questions about the meaning of life, about the decisions we've made, about the paths we chose to follow. And this is where something even deeper becomes clear. Within the Christian vision, the end of time is not simply the end of the world as we know it. It is the moment when everything that has happened throughout history finally reveals its true meaning. Every human choice, every personal journey, every quiet transformation that unfolded behind the scenes of history becomes part of a much greater reality. And when that perspective begins to make sense, an unavoidable question arises. If human history is moving toward this moment of complete revelation, then perhaps the signs we see along the way are not just isolated events, but pieces of a much larger process guiding humanity toward its final encounter with truth. If this reflection resonates with you, leave a comment below. This makes sense to me. And when we reach this point in our conversation, after exploring so many reflections about the final judgment, the symbols of revelation, and what the Church's tradition actually teaches, perhaps the most interesting realization is that this topic isn't really just about the end of the world. It's much more about the meaning of the human journey, about the decisions we make every single day, about the mindset we choose to cultivate, about what unfolds behind the scenes of history, far from the eyes of most people, yet still leaving deep marks on the direction of humanity. Because if there truly is a moment when all truth will be revealed, then every choice we make today is already part of that greater story. And maybe that's exactly what makes this subject so powerful. It's not simply about a distant event in the future. It's about the way each generation builds its own path, somewhere between truth and illusion, between conscious decisions and roads that often seem invisible in the present moment. If you've stayed with me all the way through this reflection, I'm genuinely glad you did. Conversations like this only make sense when there are people willing to pause for a few minutes and think about ideas that go beyond the surface. If you made it all the way to the end, leave a comment below and write, "I'm with you until the end." That way I'll know who truly made it to this part of the journey. And if this conversation made you reflect, if any part of this content gave you a new perspective or sparked an important question inside you, go ahead and leave a like on the video as well. It may seem like a small gesture, but it makes a much bigger difference than most people realize. It tells the algorithm that this kind of content, mixing history, spirituality, and reflection, deserves to reach more people. And if you enjoy exploring topics like faith, biblical prophecy, the mysteries of the Vatican, and deeper interpretations of Scripture, make sure to subscribe to the channel. The goal here is to keep uncovering these themes that often remain hidden behind the scenes of history and rarely get explained with patience and depth. And before you go, there's a video right here on the side that connects perfectly with everything we talked about today. It goes even deeper into this journey through prophecies, signs, and the mysteries surrounding the future of humanity. Click on it, and I'll see you there.